Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, and clinical operations. We offer two engagement models, which are consulting and staff augmentation. So if you're finding yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I am speaking with Carlos Carrillo. Hey, Carlos, how are you doing today?
I am good. Happy to be here.
Okay, well, I really appreciate you joining the podcast. Before we jump into the topic for today, would you kindly introduce yourself?
For sure. My name is Carlos Carrillo. I've spent nearly 3 decades navigating the full spectrum of drug development, from early research and clinical operations through to regulatory approvals and commercial readiness. Over the years, I've held leadership roles across operations, R&D, regulatory affairs, quality, and project management, and I've guided programs for both small and large molecules from phase one all the way to launch. I've had the privilege for many organizations of leading global regulatory submissions that include IMD, BLAs, NDAs, CTAs across the globe as well, and really just leading strategically for organizations, especially around the expedited designations such as fast track and breakthrough therapy. My work has also spanned through different therapeutic areas from oncology and infectious diseases to cardiology, autoimmune disorders, neurology, which included the CNS disorders. And along the way, I pursued academic training. I have a PhD in regulatory law for drug products, medical devices, and biologics, and I have a master's in drug product patent and intellectual law as well. That education really did, with my hands-on experience, really did help shape how I help companies navigate the complex path from clinical development to commercialization. I think what excites me about today's conversation is the central challenge many clinical stage companies face, right? The question here is how to bridge the gap between strong science and successful commercialization without the infrastructure of resources of big pharma. Having built inspection-ready systems, I've led cross-functional teams and negotiated complex regulatory pathways. I've seen firsthand how smaller organizations can leverage strategy, partnerships, and smart execution to complete at scale. So just looking forward to having some of these questions come forward.
Absolutely. Well, very impressive background, and certainly is a strong connection to what we're going to be talking about today. And I think you kind of alluded to it in your introduction. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So in terms of the transition from clinical operations to commercial execution, why is that such a big inflection point for biotechs today?
Yeah, the movement from clinical stage development to commercial launch marks more than just another milestone in any organizational's life cycle. It's an existential pivot, right? So frequently described, I know I've heard many executives call this building the plane while flying it.
Yeah.
Um, Missteps can mean not just delayed market entry, but total value destruction. So you're asking, well, what does all of that mean, right? So if you think about it, throughout the years, and the stakes every year seems to be escalating due to several industry trends. And I think some of those bigger trends, Nicholas, is about shifting pipeline ownership. I think the biotechs, they do contribute over two-thirds of the R&D pipeline, and especially in needed spaces like oncology, neurology, and rare diseases, right? The competitive pressure heightens the expectations from investors and partners. I mean, my current organization is currently seeing a bit of this as well, right? And a lot of that impacts your capital intensity and investors' scrutiny. So what does that mean, right? Investors are more demanding on launch execution and speed to market. So tolerance for missteps starts to shrink. And there's other pieces that get impacted here. Things like your compressed timelines, right? If you have a breakthrough accelerated approval pathway, it really does move products quicker, leaving little room for organizational build out. And at times that could be kind of a handcuff. And then there's always the reputational stake, right? Where smaller companies increasingly drive some of these therapies, and a failed launch doesn't just hurt one firm. It can really sour investors and payer confidence across the entire modality or therapeutic area of that particular technology. And then if you think about any type of delay and the cost around the delays, the cumulative impact of that. Even if you're looking at a huge delays or a short delays, a 1 month slip can nearly mean $500 million in some therapeutic areas, as loss in potential revenue, which can alter investment confidence and valuation of that modality as well. And then you got to look at all the competitive displacements, right? In some of these spaces and crowded therapeutic areas, a delayed launch often means competitors may seize first mover advantage, which, it does lend to that displacement that I'm speaking of here. Payer dynamics is also impacted. And then if you think about the strategic opportunity cost, right? Beyond immediate sales, delays can jeopardize follow-on indications, right? A lot of this life cycle management strategies or any additional co-development partnerships can also get a hold of this, and that really depends on the timely market entry. I think a lot of these things you think about ahead of time.
Mm.
And then if you think about the regulatory piece here, and also the regulatory piece also impacts your payer scrutiny here, right? So the heightened expectations from regulators, payers, and also some of these advocacy groups, they do have increased complexity and risk at the commercial threshold. Anything, as I mentioned earlier, the accelerated approval process, right? Speed, time to market. Also, it comes with that heightened post-market commitment and scrutiny of some of these additional post-approval trials that some of these smaller companies may not be ready for. And then your value demonstration, right? Payers are now demanding cost-effective models, right? And you have to be able to budget for that impact. And then the global divergence, right? The regulatory and payer requirements are really across many different geographies, forcing smaller companies to manage multiple evidence packages and negotiation strategies simultaneously. I think a lot of that is really a huge impact. And then there's many other things that there's a kind of the whole ecosystem dependence, right? Unlike large pharma, clinical stage biotechs cannot afford parallel investments in every function or infrastructure. And I think we'll touch on some of these later with the other questions to come. I think the strategic decisions around partnering, outsourcing, and internal build become existentially important. So that's the big piece of this, and that's why this transition is so pivotal. It's not just about getting a product to market. It's about proving the company can survive and thrive commercially. The biotechs that succeed are the ones that start planning early, and I said before, especially with expedited programs, as early as late phase 2 across the entire infrastructure, which includes supply chain, your regulatory, and even that market shaping piece where people don't start thinking about that until you get to that phase 3 trial or planning for that marketing application. And then the culture is also impacted at times here as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot. There's a lot there, Nicholas.
Well, certainly you've set the stage for some of the challenges that these companies are going to face as they transition from the clinic into the commercial realm. And this might seem a little bit redundant because you did kind of highlight this in the sense of challenges, but I'll ask a very similar question in a different way. What are some of the kind of common pitfalls that these organizations can expect to face, and what would be your recommendation on maybe some quick, easy tips, tricks in order to try to avoid some of those easier to fall into pits?
Yeah, beyond the market preparation, I think the biggest pitfalls are often internal. Companies do underestimate the operational complexity of scaling, and they rely too heavily on partners without strong oversight. And sometimes, struggle with
Mm.
cultural resistance to commercialization. To be honest, this is a big piece of it, the internal resistance of change. And then to add to that, there's always this piece where you have like this governance and investor pressure that also, feeds into that recipe for delays. Again, I think to be successful, you have to balance external readiness with a lot of internal disciplines, right? So building systems, culture, and governance that can carry your organization beyond that first launch. And then just to hit up some of these pieces, I think the insufficient market preparation, right? That impacts your pricing and access missteps, right? And so failure to anticipate payer pushback, health technology assessments, things of that nature shall uptake even when the clinical value is clear. It does add to some pitfalls as you progress. And then I think one of the other pieces that I've also observed throughout the years is the overestimating of the physician readiness, right?
Hmm.
So assuming rapid adaptation without accounting for any entrenched treatment habits, right? So even if you're in a pivotal study, once you get to that post-approval things do pop up, and that overestimating of that readiness can be overlooked. And then internally, right, the operational complexity here, moving from clinical to commercial means scaling supply chain, QA, QC, pharmacovigilance, and many biotechs do underestimate the rigor regulators expect for commercial grade systems. For instance, tech transfer failures or inadequate cold chain planning, and these are some simple examples. These can delay, and they have delayed launches in the past for me. And I've for firsthand experienced this. And then I mentioned the fragmented governance, right? I think small companies do lack the integrated governance across clinical, regulatory, CMC, and commercial. And then without that unified roadmap, functions seem to progress in silos, and that leads to a lot of misaligned priority and missed deadlines. And then the other piece that I'm very leery of is the over reliance on external partners. CROs, CDMOs, and consultants, they are critical. But if oversight is weak, companies do risk compliance gaps. I've seen data integrity issues because of this, or loss of that strategic control, right? Outsourcing the brain, your strategy, your company
Hmm.
vision, can occur instead of just the execution piece for what you're hiring the external partners to do.
Yeah.
And then I mentioned the internal resistance, right? The cultural resistance to commercialization. I think a lot of the scientists and R&D teams may see commercialization as selling out or a distraction from, leaders don't manage this cultural shift, morale and alignment will suffer. And those are some of the bigger examples that I've experienced within these pitfalls.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like the pendulum has swung too far to the other side. So in the past, it was we that the concern was, oh, we know everything, we don't need to listen to everyone. Now it's gone so far as, well, they're an expert, so I'm just going to do whatever they say, right? And so there's got to be that balance of making sure that you're seeking outside advice, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with you, and you have to be able to make the right decisions through all of the different, consults and advising that you get. And then picking what aspects of the organization are need to be internal and what needs to be out external, right? And then also, what in this particular conversation, understanding as we move from the clinic into the commercial realm, um, where is regulatory affairs? Where is quality? Where is our supply chain? Where's IT? Are they underdeveloped? Are they where they need to be? How do I assess that? So I would say that's certainly one question that I'd like you to kind of comment on. And then beyond that, what should people be thinking of in terms of consultants, CROs, contract partners as playing in the larger plan for going commercial?
For sure, for sure. Boy, I tell you, when you're moving from the clinic to the cusp of commercialization, The science may be world class, but the organization themselves are often underbuilt. This is where the company stops being a research project and becomes a business accountable organization, right? And so you're now accountable to regulators, to payers, patients, and investors, and it happens all at once.
Wow.
Here, that most common pitfalls also emerge, right? They underdeveloped cross-functional capabilities, and it's not because of weak science, but because of critical functions and how the organization has not thought about the commercialization piece. If you look at regulatory affairs, many companies underestimate the complexity of filings and especially that global synchronization because some of these pivotal studies now are global studies. And so you're now managing, ex-US health authorities versus the FDA. And then there's always gaps in CMC alignment, accelerated pathway preparation, and kind of that post-approval compliance often lead to some CRLs or delays, right? Those response letters are not something you want to see. I think to mitigate some of this, you really have to build a regulatory roadmap as early as phase two, where everything is integrated. You integrate the CMC early, you simulate inspections, and you treat regulatory as a continuous life cycle function. I always try to think about the mitigation of these underdeveloped or cross-functional capabilities. And then you look at quality assurance and quality control. QA/QC is often treated as a late stage kind of bolt-on, which,
Right.
which leaves systems like non-inspection ready. Those are some of the bigger pieces here. And for me, here's what I've also seen, to be honest, here is to be candid, is that, you know, I want to make this point that in order to maintain compliance and inspection readiness, it's critical to operate under a single unified quality unit. Many organizations have separated QA and QC into different reporting lines. I've seen 483s come about with that. And if you place QC, for example, under operations, this creates a conflict of interest and undermines the regulatory expectation
Yeah.
for independence and just that QA oversight. So both QA and QC function should be integrated components of one quality. I like to make that statement because it's happened.
I've seen it.
Boy, I'm at least two to three different organizations back. And then you look at their manufacturing. I think people underestimate the scale up challenges, right? And the over reliance of CMOs. I think having a standardized tech transfer playbook becomes extremely important. And then when you look at the supply chain, right, everyone just starts off with that single source dependencies, and right, they don't realize that the more complexity you have within your modality, that this exposes a lot of vulnerabilities, to be honest. And then the IT and digital infrastructure. Everyone thinks that, oh, the vendor's got a validation package, even if they're cloud-based systems, we're fine with. It's not, right? You have to implement your internal validated Part 11, Annex 11 compliance systems. And you've got to start thinking about that digital architecture and the embedded cybersecurity and establish that master data governance, right? I think that's a big missteps in a lot of the organizations. And then, I talked about the resistance, right? And then that culture and leadership kind of starts to hit you, where many organizations kind of remain science centric, which the incentives are tied to R&D milestones, right? If you're still managing under that model, this creates resistance to the commercialization piece, and then there's an unclear accountability, and then decisions become slow, right? At the end of the day, Nicholas, the transition from clinic to commercial is not just about scaling science, right? It's really about scaling the systems, the culture, and the governance. And most of these common gaps show up in regulatory QA, QC, or the quality unit, manufacturing, supply chain, and IT. I think those are the bigger underdeveloped functions as you progress within the clinic to commercialization.
Super. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Just from my own perspective, with all of this stuff that needs to be managed, how do I make sure that I'm controlling this? How do I make sure I'm not dropping balls? I think that's really what I want to focus on is how do I make sure I'm not dropping balls? So here at the FDA group, we implemented EOS, which is the Entrepreneurial Operating System. I know a lot of other reputable firms use that too. It is a way to make now that doesn't address everything anything that we're talking about in this call. What it does do is it creates a structure so that balls don't get dropped and things
Yeah.
get followed up on. So just for the audience, if all of this sounds overwhelming and you don't know how to manage it all, that's one resource that you might want to look into. The founder, Gina Wickman, wrote a book called Traction. It's a very good book. And I would say that's kind of EOS light. You could read that book first before you considered that. Also, I've been interviewed, many times, and one of the questions I often get is, what advice would you give to, entrepreneurs and things to that nature? And I don't like the cliches and the platitudes, and so I say, implement EOS and get your MBA. So I don't want to I don't, I want to underscore the value of an MBA and having to scale an organization or, especially I think the value becomes even more pronounced as you're going from the clinic to commercial, right?
Yeah.
The last thing I wanted to comment on, which is actually going to transition really well into our next topic, is the concept of using external partners. I think I look at it in terms of maturity and graduation. So when you're going out, use your CDMOs, right? Create
Yeah.
the appropriate infrastructure. Use CROs before you move to an FSP. So feel free to use these, understanding that you maintain accountability and responsibility, and you have to make the decisions. And while it's good to not think that you have all the answers, don't also think that you can just rely on everybody for strategic decision making. And then look for opportunities to mature, right? Are there opportunities where you can bring something in-house or create enhanced controls or diversify supply chains and things of that nature? So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. So with that said, um, you know, how do these organizations evaluate and integrate these partners without losing control and creating inefficiencies?
Yeah, I think, not every company can do everything in-house, right? So really you have to look at your evaluating your partners. Kind of, I try to say when you're looking at and there's usually a process of evaluating three different firms and then make that decision, right? And so you want
I
to
say three to
evaluate
five. No less than three, no more than
all three
five.
because it takes, I'm gonna tell you, it takes so long to do the evaluation. We stick it at three and then look
Three,
at
three,
the
three,
pros.
th- three's in there, so that works.
And I try to look beyond the pitch deck, right? I try to look at uh, the therapeutic and kind of the phase specific expertise. And I will ask for case studies and references relevant to the modality and stage you're in. And then I try to also see if I can see the operational agility, right? Can they handle protocol amendments? And I'll have tons of questions around things like this. I try to ask about supply chain partners or anything related to a possible regulatory curveball if you're expecting an RFI for something you've submitted, look at their experience. And then I also try to establish clear escalation pathways and make sure that there's open communication to see how that will work internally between the sponsor as well as that partner. And then really the incentive alignment, right? I think one of the things that's missed in a lot of these contracts and the scope of work is the timely piece, right? And I think contracts, there should be something in there to reward timely kind of quality execution, not just, I don't want to just have billable hours in there. So we try to add some pieces to it to make it kind of more representative of the expectations because every small company, time is gold, right? You cannot lose time. And then integrating the partners is another piece, right? Making them extensions of the team. Um, Really, the internal ownership. You need to assign accountable people for each partner relationship, not just the procurement piece. That's an important piece, but there's also little pieces within those firms that do different things. And then that's where the governance comes in, right? You need to establish like that joint operating committees, kind of look at doing things like the risk and scenario planning, and making sure everything is visible to the organization. And then I think quality and compliance oversight, embedded QA review right into every workflow, never outsource accountability. We are, at the end of the day, the sponsor is accountable for everything that goes out. And then there's also the piece about the digital integration, build systems for data sharing, audit trails, and reporting across organizations. Just because here's what I hear a lot, Nicholas, is, oh yeah, the vendor's got a procedure around this. But
Right.
how are we internally going to manage this? Because that is the first question an auditor will be asking. So, right, that's the kind of conversations we need to have with people who haven't gone down this path before. And then kind of that knowledge piece, right? You need to document the decisions and processes to prevent any institutional memory loss when kind of consultants come and go. And I think that's a big piece of this. And I think the external partners can be a force multiplier or a liability, right? The difference lies in how the sponsor evaluates and integrates them. I think that's the big piece. And the strategy must be kept in house. You have to build disciplined governance and, again, the transparency and alignment to turn any fragmented ecosystem into a coordinated engine for launch. And I think those are the big pieces, and that's how I evaluate all partners and external folks coming in to help get us to launch.
Hence the reason you limit it to three.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Um, well, let's make this conversation even more fun.
yeah.
So let's take into account the evolving regulatory expectations, and how that shapes the commercialization roadmap. So where do you see companies most often stumbling in that regard?
Yeah, and this is a great question. I think regulatory expectations today are not static. They're really dynamic, right?
Right.
They're data driven and increasingly commercial in nature. That's how your decisions need to be made. What used to be a linear path from the commercial success to approval is now constantly shifting, by the evolving guidances. There's always new data requirements, and there's always that heightened scrutiny, right? So for smaller companies, this means commercialization planning can't wait until the finish line. It has to be built in as early as you can. But again, a lot of that also depends on funding and investors. So how do you shape this? You asked me, you talk about building this roadmap. How do you shape that? What would the expectations be? Honestly, I think CMC rigor is very important, right? Making sure that you have agreed upon comparability protocols so that you know which data is needed with the FDA, and kind of making sure you built in some of the QBD controls well before approval. That way you're not behind the wagon on that. And also, the inclusion and some of this, the needed real world data, right? Regulators want evidence that therapies work across diverse populations and some of these real world settings, right? And I think the trial design and evidence generation strategies becomes very important. And then the digital trials and the data integrity piece, right? There's a lot of these centralized models and digital endpoints that you have to consider. Again, I always bring up the cybersecurity, and there's always that chain of custody, because this impacts the global compliance and should be a part of the roadmap that you're building. And also making sure that the guidances as you're progressing, right? Some of these studies are 3 to 4 years. You want to make sure that with these advanced modalities, that and these guidances that evolve so quickly, you must be able to have agility into this roadmap. And then the life cycle management piece. This is a huge piece where, you know, as you build that roadmap to your marketing application, approval is not where you stop. Approval is no longer the finish line. It's about risk management plans, the pharmacovigilance, and the kind of the global surveillance that needs to be built into this plan. And then if you look at that, so how do you do all of that? Because this is kind of a lot of the places where companies will stumble, right? That they treat regulatory as a kind of a late stage hurdle, right? Instead of embedding it across functions, companies, have regulatory siloed until submission, right? And that doesn't work that way. It has to be a regulatory strategy moving your product forward with concurrences from the FDA, and also making sure that you're being reactive to guidance changes. How will everyone on the CMC side know what's happening with these guidances if you're not hand in hand with regulatory QA and QC, right? So and then the outsourcing without oversight. That has occurred as well, relying too heavily on CROs or consultants without maintaining that strategic control will create some compliance and documentation gaps. For me, the evolving regulatory expectations, don't just shape the commercialization roadmap. They are the roadmap. And that's what I try to tell people. You have to be hand in hand with regulatory all the way through.
Absolutely. And leads me into the next thought I have, which might be impossible to answer, but I'll try anyway.
Yeah.
As we know, compliance gaps can derail launch. It can cause long-term damage to a company's credibility. Are there specific strategies that you could share that could help biotechs avoid these compliance gaps that can lead to those outcomes?
For sure. I think the first thing they need to think about is make sure that they don't, compliance is not just a checklist, right? Compliance is the foundation of credibility. Regulators expect companies to be inspection ready every single day. It's not just that submission. And the cost of getting it wrong isn't just a delay. It can derail a huge launch, especially if it's your first marketing application. It can trigger costly remediation and definitely will permanently damage trust with your regulators, with the investors, with the patients. I think that's the first thing. It's not just a checklist, right? And then some other strategies that will help you down this road is the continuous gap assessments, right? Bring in external experts to run GMP audits before every major milestone. This kind of helps you prevent blind spots and demonstrates a proactive oversight to regulators. And not just that, because, usually these smaller organizations, right, they don't have the folks doing the day-to-day that have been doing this for many, many years and that have taken products to market. I've worked with organizations where you can maybe count a handful of people that have taken something to market, so the understanding may not be there. And then the commercial simulations. What I've seen also happens here is that people wait until they get to like engineering batch before PPQ to simulate a commercial batch production. That's, you need to stress test your systems under real world conditions. And I think, especially if you're doing your own manufacturing, I think that's very important. Or if you're using a CDMO, you want to stress test that piece prior to engineering batches, prior to PPQ. Um, and then the data integrity by design, right? I think I've heard this a few times. Oh, well, we've got some history with these parameters and controls. And I'm like, well, you know, you have to embed like the Alcoa principles into every process, right? The attributable, the legible, the contemporaneous, original, and accurate pieces. It's your defense in an inspection and the backbone of trust. I can't express that enough. I find myself saying that many times. And then the oversight of partners as well, right? The CMOs and CROs, like I said earlier, they are extensions of our license, right? The quality unit oversight must be active, not passive. And I think that's a big piece of this. And then invest in validated e-systems, e-signatures, audit trails, because this is kind of where people fail, right? You want to reduce human error and kind of strengthen your inspection readiness piece. And then just the culture. You need to train staff for, any unannounced inspections and any kind of whistleblower type of scenarios. If you're somewhat ready, and I can't say you can be ready every day, but you should be as ready as you possibly can. You never have to scramble, right? And then one of the bigger pieces too is the kappa and the launch readiness, right? Treat the corrective and preventive action systems as part of your go-to market plan, not as your post-approval fix. And I'll leave with this. I'm with this question. Compliance isn't a cost center. It's really a credibility engine. And I think uh, the companies that stumble are the ones that use it as kind of a checkbox item, and that's not the correct approach.
Yeah, excellent. Hey, easy enough. Um, so, but in reality, right? So, now, I, as I'm, painting a picture in my head, we're moving from the clinic, moving forward. We've talked about all this great information. There are investments that need to be made. There's investments in infrastructures, investments in systems, people, resources. How how do people prioritize all of this stuff?
Yeah, this is another big piece, right? In these smaller companies, when resources are scarce, and I'm gonna just be very, I'm gonna be very candid here, right? Executives have to be rootless about sequencing. Build only what you must for that particular phase, and outsource what you can, right? And focus first on non-negotiables like regulatory infrastructure and critical manufacturing capacity. I think the smartest companies invest in scalable digital backbones, right? And keep fixed costs light. I think that's a big piece, right? And the phase appropriate sequencing, building what you must and just outsource, until you need to scale. And the prioritization piece is extremely important. You need to focus on that non-negotiable infrastructure like regulatory, right? And things like for your clinical ETMF pieces, I think
Okay.
critical path
Yeah.
and it kind of there are failure points as well here.
I don't mean to interrupt, but one thing I just wanted to kind of interject into your explanation is, as we're talking about these investments, one thing that I have a strong opinion on, and I just want to make it known, is do not invest in homegrown systems, especially in this day of
Oh,
AI. I know companies that are doing that, and you know what? What they're creating is awesome now. It's not going to be awesome later because you are not a software company. You yourself are competing with an ecosystem of all of these other businesses that are trying to create the next big thing. And I guarantee you that if you put your one company up against that whole ecosystem, you're going to lose. So
yeah.
use AI, use technology. Please don't invest in homegrown technology systems. Just wanted to say it.
No, no, boy, you hit a trigger point for me because there's some battles around some things that some homegrown systems that have been used and things like that and the resistance to now we need to kind of
Ditch it.
you know get to the modern pieces. So you hit that right on target. I think a part of this is also and it's easy to say this, but it's one of the toughest things to do is to anticipate, what comes around that curve, right? The pre-building or the negotiating options with growth in mind, kind of that scenario planning for scale, trying to see, what that endpoint looks like for the organization.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that was,
And just one little example. So we use an ATS system, an applicant tracking system. Okay. If that was my home, and we just are looking at two others that we're most likely going to migrate to. Okay. The capabilities of those two systems, if that ATS was mine, my ability to be able to develop what those other ATSs created, it would cost so much time and money. And by the time I caught up, there's a whole new set of things and capabilities that they're able to do. So don't mean to. beat the point, but I have seen within this new age of AI, people getting a little too excited to create their own homegrown systems, and hopefully, the simplest way I can put it is you versus an entire ecosystem.
Yeah, I agree with you though. I'm on board with that.
Yeah. Well, I want to keep this thing going. So let's talk about leadership mindset shifts. Okay. So we're moving from a science-driven culture to one that's really focused on market readiness and sustainability. So what are some of those leadership and mindset shifts that people should be prepared to make?
Yeah, this is another one where culture is important, right? Because right now, a lot of these clinical organizations, right, it's often built around discovery, right? The thrill of the science is, as I've heard, the next molecule, next milestone. But you know, the first things you have to do is try to get towards that commercialization, and because that's at the end of the day the definition of success. It's no longer about what you can discover, right? And that mind shift is tough. It's about what you can deliver. Delivering to patients, to payers, to markets requires a fundamental leadership mindset shift, right? That's you know, you gotta move from being guardians of science to becoming stewards of sustainability. Those are the big pieces. And I think some of the things that I try to communicate is, looking at your systems, right? And where you are from a science standpoint. And kind of early stage companies think in terms of projects, one trial, one molecule. You have to evolve to think in terms of programs and ultimately platforms, building enduring abilities in regulatory supply chain, the quality unit. And then, I always mention the market access because that's always the last. And then from the discovery centric to now being patient centric, right? The lab bench is no longer the center of gravity. The patient, the payer, and the provider are. And you must embed this into every decision and communicate it throughout the organization, right? From trial design to pricing strategy. You got to ensure that your modality, your therapy is approvable and it's accessible and sustainable, and then you got to walk away from silos to integration, right? Science-driven cultures often operate in functional silos. Commercial readiness requires transparency, rapid escalation, and accountability across every single function, including R&D. Leaders, must model cross-functional collaboration and not have those barriers in place. And then you're going to always fight the resistance to change, right? The embracing of this. Commercialization introduces cultural friction. Scientists may feel commercialization dilutes innovation, right? And so a big piece of this is you have to communicate the why behind commercialization. At the same time, you have to reward innovation in both the lab and the market context and kind of celebrate wins across the value chain. So you have to have a balance there. But the biggest leadership shift is moving from a culture that celebrates discovery alone to one that celebrates delivery. And I think that's the key piece of this.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Well, I want to try to wrap this up, and so as I'm gonna throw the kind of the last question or two questions at you, I imagine you holding two sticks and trying to spin plates because this is gonna be your grand finale. So. What does a clear roadmap for commercial readiness look like in practice for these organizations? And then at the same time, how can these companies balance speed to market pressures from investors and patients with the need for long-term scalability and compliance?
Yeah, boy, again, that roadmap is extremely important. And I'll just some of the things that I mentioned before. The piece of the roadmap, it needs to be sequential. It's not linear, right? So really, if you think about how each milestone triggers a cross-functional review, kind of the gap assessments, kind of recalibrate yourself, right? It's the cycle of progress, and it's never a straight line. and then really looking at balancing short-term execution with the long-term vision, right? Some of the things that you think about is for the near term is things like your trial execution, the regulatory submission around that, and kind of preparing for inspection readiness, things of that nature. That's kind of near term. Long term, you got to make sure you have scalable. Look at the pharmacovigilance, the market access infrastructure. Those are the bigger pieces. And then I think a big one there is the obligations post-launch, because that's what's going to come into your pre-market, like your pre-BLA meeting and your pre-NDA meetings with the FDA. You're going to embed risk management. You're going to anchor in patients and how that impacts the market. And then you're going to look at things around stage gate launch readiness, processes, and things of that nature. So for me, the roadmap incorporates all of those things, right? So that's the big summary. And then looking at balancing speed to market, I think this is a key piece here, because every CEO, every executive faces the same paradox, right? Patients and investors want therapies yesterday, while regulators and payers demand assurance that the products are safe, consistent, and sustainable, right? Leadership can't choose one over the other. It's designing the system that deliver both. Easier said than done, right? Speed and sustainability aren't opposites. And I'm gonna say this because my dad said this a lot. There are two sides of the same coin, right? And that's the balance you have to find. So how do you do that? You have to avoid false speed, right? Cutting corners for a fast launch will backfire. It leads to recalls, compliance gaps, supply disruptions that cost more time than credibility than they save. True speed comes from doing it right the first time. And then you have to build for scale, not just for that one approval. You need to invest in modular, scalable infrastructures, right? Manufacturing platforms, digital supply chains, and then some flexible R&D systems. This avoid one-off fixes, and that usually collapse under commercial pressure. That's why you want to stress test that. And you got to try to do some scenario planning. You want to anticipate anything around demand spikes, supply chain disruptions, or regulatory curveballs, because they will happen. Usually you want to pre-negotiate some surge capacity things, and you want to have forecasting tools so that they can flex without breaking, right? Those are some of the bigger pieces. And I think one of the bigger pieces that people don't think about, honestly, is that institutionalized learning, the continuous improvement loop, making sure that people are trained properly, things of that nature. And I always go back, Nicholas, I'll tell you, I learned from precedent. I look at what other companies have done, and I try to pick up some of the tidbits that you can find that's out there in literature. I think for me, in the end, balancing speed and sustainability is about mindset. I think companies that stumble, they chase shortcuts. You have to build resilience into your culture, and you need to invest in those scalable systems. I'll end with this, as it's something I've learned throughout the years. Cutting corners may win you a quarter, but it won't win you a market, right? True leaders design for velocity and durability. It's a tough balance.
Awesome. Well, this was an exceptional podcast. The insights that you provided today are actionable and meaningful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join. And for everyone that's listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you have not already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast, and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. If you'd like to connect about project or resource needs, head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you all next time.